There is a principle in Catholic theology about the home that most modern Catholics have never been taught, and it is this. The domestic church is not a neutral space. It is a declared space. What hangs on its walls, what sits on its shelves, what occupies the visual field of the person who prays within it. These are not decorative choices. They are declarations, and declarations once made shape the atmosphere of the space where they are made, regardless of whether the person who made them intended any spiritual consequence at all. Carlo Acutis understood this with an unusual clarity for someone his age. His mother, Antonia Salzano, in the interviews she gave following his death and canonization, described the way her son treated his room in their Milan apartment. The intentionality with which he chose every image, the care with which he kept the space, the seriousness with which he removed anything he felt, introduced a competing voice into the place where he prayed. He was not rigid about it. He was not fearful. He was precise. He understood that the space where he encountered God each day should say something clear about who was welcome there and who was not. This video is about 5 categories of things the Church's own tradition identifies as incompatible with the Catholic home. 5 types of images and objects that, when they hang on the walls of a household that is trying to pray, work against the prayer offered beneath them. Not because objects have independent power over the soul, but because what we choose to surround ourselves with shapes what we attend to, and what we attend to shapes what we become. The Church has understood this for 2,000 years. The saints have confirmed it in their lives, and Carlo Acutis lived it every day of his short life. Walk through these 5 with honest eyes. What you find may be the beginning of an answer you have been looking for a long time. The first item is the one most likely to be dismissed as a minor concern, which is exactly why it deserves to be named first. A damaged sacred image left on the wall. The Church's canon law addresses this directly. Canon 1188 states that the practice of exposing sacred images for the veneration of the faithful is to be maintained, and that these images are to be displayed in suitable fashion. The operative phrase is suitable fashion. An image displayed in a way that no longer honors what it represents is not fulfilling the purpose for which sacred images exist in the Catholic tradition. The Second Vatican Council, in its Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, instructed that bishops should remove from sacred spaces any works that offend true religious sense through damage, deterioration, or a condition that diminishes the reverence owed to what is represented. The principle was articulated for churches, but the theology behind it applies to the domestic church equally. A cracked image of the Sacred Heart, a faded portrait of Our Lady where the face can no longer be clearly seen, a framed saint whose glass has been broken and whose image shows through the damage. These are not objects that require sentimental attachment to be maintained. They require honest evaluation and, if necessary, replacement. The Second Council of Nicaea, convened in 787, and one of the great ecumenical councils of the Church, defined the theology of sacred images with precision that the Church has maintained ever since. The Council taught that honor given to a sacred image passes to its prototype, to the person represented. What this means in practical terms is that the condition of a sacred image is not spiritually indifferent. An image kept in a condition that a visitor to the home would immediately recognize as dishonoring, cracked, broken, faded to illegibility, communicates something to the person who prays before it. It says without words that the relationship between the household and the one depicted has been allowed to deteriorate along with the image. It says that what was once given prominence has been allowed to decay without notice. Carlo Acutis treated the sacred images in his home with an attentiveness that his mother remembered specifically. She described him as someone who noticed the condition of things, who did not allow sacred objects to become invisible through familiarity. He understood that an image seen every day without being truly seen had ceased to do its work, and an image that was also damaged had ceased to do its work in a more serious way. Walk through your home today and look at every sacred image with the eyes of someone seeing it for the first time, not with the eyes of someone who has passed it every morning for 20 years without stopping, with fresh eyes. Ask, Is this image in a condition that honors what it represents? If the answer is no, if it is cracked, broken, faded beyond recognition, or so deteriorated that it would embarrass you if a guest paused before it, do not leave it where it is out of sentiment. Have it restored if it can be restored. Replace it if it cannot. And ask your pastor to bless the new image when you place it. The image that honors the one it represents is the image that does its work. Everything else is a form of indifference made visible. The second item requires a more careful examination because it lives in a category that most people never think to question, and because questioning it can feel at first like an attack on artistic taste rather than a concern about spiritual atmosphere. Art that depicts suffering, darkness, or anguish without any redemptive frame. The Church's tradition of sacred art is not sentimental. It does not demand that every image depict cheerful subjects or avoid the reality of human suffering. The Pietà is one of the most beloved images in the entire Catholic tradition. A mother holding her dead son, a scene of grief with no pretense of comfort. The great crucifixes of the medieval period are unflinching in their portrayal of physical suffering. Caravaggio painted the martyrdoms of saints with a realism that was shocking in his day and remains striking in ours. The Church has never required that art be comfortable. What the Church requires, and what Sacrosanctum Concilium articulates clearly, is that sacred art be ordered toward the infinite beauty of God and serve to turn the heart toward God rather than to fix it in despair. There is a distinction, and it matters enormously, between an image that depicts suffering within a redemptive frame and an image that depicts suffering that leads nowhere. The Pietà leads somewhere. The grief of Mary is not the last word of the image. The theological context, the resurrection that follows, the redemption that the scene represents, is present in the image even when it is not depicted. The informed Catholic viewer does not see only a dead son and a grieving mother. They see the moment that preceded the empty tomb, an image of pure, uncontextualized suffering, a sorrowful figure in shadow with no cross, no saint, no light breaking through, does not carry that frame. It presents suffering as the final word. And a home where prayer is offered daily beneath an image that presents suffering as the final word is a home where the visual vocabulary of the space is working against the theological vocabulary of the faith. The faith says, suffering is not the last word. The image says, it is. These two things cannot fully coexist without tension, and the tension tends to be felt in the quality of prayer offered in that space, as heaviness, as repetition, as the sense that nothing is moving. Carlo Acutis kept his personal space consistent with his faith. His mother documented that the images in his room were images that pointed somewhere, that they carried the visual grammar of a life ordered toward God rather than the visual grammar of unresolved darkness. He was not avoiding difficulty. He was insisting on direction. He understood that the eye moves where the image points and that the heart tends to follow the eye. Look at every image in the room where you pray most often. Ask of each one, does this image point anywhere? Not, is it beautiful? Not, was it expensive? Not, did someone I love give it to me? Does it point somewhere beyond itself, toward the redemptive meaning of what it depicts, toward the presence of Christ in darkness, toward hope? If the answer is honestly no, if the image presents darkness and offers nothing beyond it, it does not belong in the domestic church. Remove it without guilt. What you place in its absence does not need to be elaborate. It only needs to point somewhere. The third item is the one most likely to have arrived in your home without any spiritual intention at all. As a souvenir, as a gift from someone who meant well, as something purchased at a market that seemed beautiful or interesting, or simply decorative. Objects and wall hangings that carry occult, esoteric, or non-Christian spiritual symbolism. The Catechism of the Catholic Church addresses this with precision in sections 21:10 through 21:17 in its treatment of the first commandment. The Catechism does not limit its concern to active participation in occult practices, to seeking the advice of mediums, to consulting horoscopes, to engaging in ritual practices condemned by the Church. It addresses the broader question of what the Catholic home and the Catholic life make room for in terms of spiritual influence. And its answer, consistent with 20 centuries of church teaching, is this: the Christian home belongs to Christ entirely, without reservation, and what occupies it should reflect that belonging. This is not a teaching about intent. A woman who hangs a decorative wall piece containing esoteric symbolism because she found it beautiful and had no idea of its spiritual identity is not committing the same offense as a woman who practices divination. But she has introduced into her home's visual field a symbol whose spiritual identity is not Christian, a symbol that belongs to a tradition other than the one she is trying to live, and the cumulative effect of living within a visual environment that sends mixed messages about whose the household is creates exactly the spiritual confusion that the Church has always warned against. Carlo Acutis grew up in Milan, a cosmopolitan city where the casual mixing of spiritual symbols was culturally ordinary. Crystal shops sold items alongside rosaries. Protection symbols from various traditions were displayed in the same windows as crucifixes. He was not sheltered from this, and he was not alarmed by it. But from a very young age, he understood something that many adults around him had not articulated: that a symbol carries the spiritual identity of the tradition it comes from, regardless of whether the person using it understands that identity. His mother documented that he kept his room with what she called radical clarity, only images whose Christian identity was unambiguous. He described this not as a restriction, but as a form of integrity. He wanted his space to say one thing clearly because he wanted his life to say one thing clearly. The practical examination is simple. Take every decorative object in your home that contains a symbol you cannot identify as clearly Christian in its origin and meaning. The evil eye, the dream catcher, the Hamza, the Om, the pentagram, the all-seeing eye, symbols from Buddhist, Hindu, Aztec, or other non-Christian spiritual traditions. If you cannot say with confidence that this symbol belongs to the Christian tradition, it does not belong on the walls of a domestic church. Not because you are a bad person for having it, not because the gift giver intended you harm, but because your home has a spiritual identity, and everything in it participates in that identity, whether you have asked it to or not. Remove what does not belong. Do it simply without drama. And in the absence it leaves, place what does belong: a crucifix, a Marian image, a blessed candle, a sacred image of a saint. Let the space say what you believe. The fourth item is the most personal, the one that asks something of you that may feel difficult because it touches objects you may have loved for a very long time and that connect you to people you may no longer be able to hold. Religious images inherited from family members, displayed in your home without ever being specifically blessed for their new context. The Church's theology of blessings, of sacramentals, of the prayers the Church offers for objects and spaces, is rooted in the understanding that a blessing is an act of intentional consecration. It directs God's grace through a specific object toward a specific purpose. When an object changes hands, when it passes from one generation to the next, from one household to another, the blessing it may have received in its original context has not necessarily transferred in its full force to the new context. The Church's practice of blessing homes, of blessing inherited objects, of asking a priest to pray specifically over something that has come into a household, is not superstition. It is a recognition that intention matters, that context matters, and that bringing an object formally before God for blessing in its new home is an act of proper stewardship. Saint Benedict of Nursia, whose life was documented by Pope Saint Gregory the Great in his dialogues in the 6th century, understood with particular clarity the spiritual weight that places and objects can carry from the history of those who inhabited them. Gregory documents in the dialogues that when Benedict first established his community at Monte Cassino, he found the site occupied by the remnants of a pagan temple, a place that had been used for idol worship and that carried, in Benedict's understanding, the spiritual residue of what had taken place there. He did not simply build his monastery on top of the ruins. He prayed over the site. He smashed the altar of Apollo. He asked for a specific act of consecration before the space was used for Christian prayer. He understood that the history of a place or an object does not disappear simply because new occupants arrive with good intentions. It requires a deliberate act of reconsecration, of bringing the place or object before God and asking that its history be released and its purpose renewed. This principle applies with direct force to the religious images that pass between generations in Catholic families. A large framed print of the Last Supper that hung for decades in the home of a grandmother who prayed faithfully, who then passed through years of illness and grief and perhaps the loss of her faith before she died. That image has witnessed a spiritual history. It carries the memory of a prayer life that flourished and perhaps struggled and perhaps grew cold. It is not contaminated by that history. It is not spiritually dangerous in itself, but it has passed through human experience that may have left its mark on the space it occupied, and bringing it into your home with a specific prayer of blessing, asking a priest to pray over it, asking God to receive it fresh as a vehicle of grace in your specific household, your specific prayer life, your specific moment of faith, is not an act of anxiety. It is an act of care. It is what the Church provides for exactly this situation. If you have inherited religious images in your home that have never been specifically blessed for your household, take them to your pastor. Call and make an appointment. Tell him that you have an inherited image and that you would like him to pray over it and bless it for its place in your home. It takes a few minutes. What it does is real. And what it gives you in return is the image you love, still in its place, but carrying not only the memory of the person who held it before you, but the formal prayer of the Church that has released whatever it carried and consecrated it for the prayer life you are trying to build. The fifth item is the most serious, and the one most likely to have been in your home for so long and to have arrived in such an innocent way that you have never once thought to question it. Images, figurines, or decorative objects depicting deities, sacred figures, or objects of veneration from non-Christian religious traditions. The first commandment is the foundation of everything that follows. You shall have no other gods before me. The Church has never interpreted this as applying only to formal acts of worship, to bowing before an idol, to offering sacrifice to a foreign deity, to practices that any Catholic would immediately recognize as incompatible with the faith. The Church interprets it as applying to the entire disposition of the Christian life, including the domestic space. What a home honors, what it gives visual prominence to, what it places in the positions a religious household reserves for the sacred, is not a private aesthetic choice without spiritual consequence. It is a declaration of allegiance, and a home that displays the Buddha alongside the crucifix, or a Hindu deity alongside the image of Our Lady, or any figure from a non-Christian spiritual tradition in a position of honor in a household that is trying to pray to the God of Jesus Christ. That home has made a declaration it may not have intended to make, and the confusion that declaration introduces into the spiritual atmosphere of the space is real. Pope John Paul II, in his encyclical Fides et Ratio, wrote with care and respect about the wisdom traditions of non-Christian religions. The Church does not teach that other traditions contain nothing of value, or that the people who hold them are without dignity or sincerity. What the Church teaches, consistently from the first commandment through 20 centuries of theological reflection, is that the Christian home is the domestic church of the one God who revealed himself in Jesus Christ, and that this home is not a museum of comparative religion. It is a sanctuary, and a sanctuary by definition is a space that has been set apart, consecrated to a specific presence, declared as belonging to a specific Lord. Carlo Acutis said, in words his mother Antonia preserved, and that have been widely quoted since his canonization, "All we have to do is keep the flame of faith alive, and it will illuminate everything." The image of a flame is precise. A flame kept in a space free of competing drafts burns steadily. The same flame kept in a space where competing currents move freely, flickers, gutters, and under the right conditions goes out. Not because the flame is weak, not because the person tending it has failed, but because the space itself has not been given to the flame. Your faith is the flame. Your home is the space. And every image, every figurine, every decorative object in that home that represents a spiritual tradition other than the one you have given your life to is a current of air that the flame must contend with. Not dramatically, not with crisis, but persistently, over time, in the quiet way that competing spiritual presences work, through the gradual dimming of prayer, through the sense that the atmosphere of the home is not quite what it should be, through the feeling that something invisible stands between the prayer offered and the God it is addressed to. The removal of these objects is not a dramatic act. It does not require ceremony or explanation. It requires only what the first commandment has always required: a decision, made clearly and kept consistently, that this household belongs to Christ. Take the figurine from the shelf. Take the print from the wall. Place them somewhere outside your home, in a donation box, in a respectful disposal wherever seems right. And in the space they leave, place what belongs there: a crucifix, an image of Our Lady, a blessed candle, something that speaks the language of the faith you are living. Your home has been trying to say something. Let it say it clearly. Beginning today. 5 items, 5 categories of things that do not belong in the domestic church. Not because they are all equally serious, not because the soul that has them is beyond God's reach, but because the home that holds them is a home whose declaration is incomplete. And the home whose declaration is incomplete is a home where prayer is working at partial capacity in a space that has not yet been fully given to God. The tradition of the church on this is not harsh. It is practical. It is the same tradition that Saint Benedict carried when he prayed over Monte Cassino before his monks moved in. It is the same tradition that shaped the domestic practices of every Catholic generation before the present one, when the family home was understood to be a sanctuary that required the same care as a place of public worship. It is not a tradition that demands perfection or constant vigilance, or a home that looks like a religious goods store. It demands only what the church has always demanded of the domestic church: intentionality, care, the willingness to ask of each thing that hangs on each wall whether it belongs here. Carlo Acutis began immediately. When he understood something about the spiritual life of his home, he did not wait for a more convenient time. He acted on what he knew and trusted God with what he did not yet understand. His mother documented this specifically, that he never delayed what he could do today, that the clarity of his faith extended to the clarity of his space. Walk through your home this week. Examine what you have allowed to remain. Ask the 5 questions this video has given you. Is this image in a condition that honors what it represents? Does it point somewhere beyond itself? Does its symbolism belong to the Christian tradition? Has it been blessed specifically for this home? And does it represent a spiritual tradition that is not the one you have given your life to? Where the answer to any of those questions calls for action, take that action. Do it simply, without drama, with the confidence of someone who knows what their home is for and is choosing to make that purpose visible in what hangs on its walls. Share this with the woman from your parish whose prayer has felt blocked for years without explanation. Share it with your daughter or granddaughter who fills her walls without thinking about what fills them. Share it with the friend who has tried every devotion and attended every retreat, and still cannot understand why the atmosphere of prayer in her home feels thin. You do not need to explain. You only need to send it. May the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit fill every room you clear with the presence that was always intended to inhabit it. And may St. Carlo Acutis, who kept his own home as a living declaration of whose it was every day of his short life, intercede for every household that chooses, beginning today, to do the same.